The Americans were able to bring over 100,000 South Vietnamese out with them.
It was nightmarish enough, but it could have been worse. The last images of the war, U.S. Marines with rifle butts pounding on the fingers of Vietnamese who tried to claw their way to freedom. Millions of dollars worth of helicopters profligately tossed overboard from U.S. rescue ships, discarded like pop-top beer cans to make room for later arriving choppers. 32,000 desperate Vietnamese managing to make their way by sampan, raft, and rowboat to the U.S. ships offshore. The century's longest war was over in an efficient but ignominious evacuation. Its toll, more than 56,000 Americans dead and 303,000 wounded, upwards of 1 million dead Vietnamese. $141 billion spent, 7 million tons of bombs dropped, and all for a war that came, more or less, to nothing.
The pullout from Vietnam marked America's final involvement to date in a major foreign war. But the pages of Time's World Department were still filled with violence and death. Even before the end of the Vietnam War, the nature of international violence began to change from the organized conflicts of nation versus nation to murderous and often senseless acts of terrorism against individuals. And to most Americans, the greatest outrage of all, the 1979 sacking of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran by forces of Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini.
It was an ugly, shocking image of madness and mob rule. Blindfolded and bound, employees of the U.S. Embassy were paraded before vengeful crowds, while their youthful captors gloated and jeered. The U.S. was all but powerless to free the victims.
Months would pass while Iranian students made a circus of the event with daily demonstrations in front of the embassy and in front of the television cameras of the world. The pressures on President Jimmy Carter mounted, forcing him to order a rescue attempt. It ended in disaster when 2 American aircraft collided in Iran.
Suddenly, flames illuminated the night sky, then gradually flickered out. On the powdery sands of Iran's Great Salt Desert lay the burned-out hulk of a lumbering U.S. Air Force C-130 Hercules aircraft. Nearby rested the scorched skeleton of a U.S. Navy helicopter, and in the wreckage were the burned bodies of 8 American military air crewmen. For Carter in particular, and for the U.S. in general, the desert debacle was a military, diplomatic, and political fiasco.
Finally, over 14 months after it began, Carter was able to negotiate the release of the hostages.
Hello? Kevin? Right on, man. That's great. That's great.
They were freed on his last day as president, just as Ronald Reagan was being sworn in as the nation's 40th chief executive. In a bold headline, Time called it America's Incredible Day, and few would disagree.
It was an extraordinary conjuncture of events, compressed almost beyond credibility. Within a mere 41 minutes, a presidency began, an ordeal ended, and the nation was swept by a sense of shared emotion and exuberance not felt in years. Hollywood would not have touched such an improbable melodrama, but so it happened last week.
And so it happened around the world during the past 60 years of time. Event crowding upon event, detail overlaying detail, statistic piling upon statistic. What a time it was. And what a time it is. The statistics, details, and events, the magazine itself, are almost as incredible as the happenings of those 60 amazing years. The statistic dearest to the heart of any magazine is its circulation. With a worldwide circulation of over 6 million copies a week in the 1980s, Time is the leader in its field. but it was not always so. The first issue of Time sold only about 9,000 copies out of a hoped-for 25,000. Things would improve more or less steadily after that, but Time never stopped looking for ways to sell more magazines. And one idea they hit upon was and remains unique. For 3 issues only, June 17th, June 24th, and July 1st, 1929, Time offered its readers a perpetual subscription. That's not a lifetime subscription, but one that goes on, and all for $60. As the offer stated, once paid, Time Forever After will bring to you and your descendants all the news of all the world every week to the end of time. And today, over a half-century later, some 170 children and grandchildren, and perhaps great-grandchildren of the wise readers who took up that offer, are still getting the benefit of that $60 investment. Time didn't only want more subscribers in those early days, it also wanted to know who they were. In 1928, the magazine sent out a questionnaire. Actually, it called it an inquisition, asking for personal background on its readers. It gave the survey the intriguing title, "Do You Own a Horse?" And the results were rather surprising. It turned out over 10% of Time's 1928 readers did indeed own horses, not including work horses, of course. 89% owned motor cars, and 10% owned 3 or more. Over 75% had gone to college. 52% had servants, and 11% had 3 or more. And 17 readers owned their own airplanes. This was, remember, just a year after Lindbergh's solo flight to Paris. All in all, a rather elite group of readers. Today, Time still feels that its readers are pretty special, and it goes to some pretty special lengths to provide them with their weekly supply of information and entertainment. 237 different editions are printed each week, and sometimes those different issues turn up in some pretty unusual places. An Iranian embassy guard probably didn't like what he was reading in Time during the hostage crisis. Socialite attempted murder suspect Klaus von Bülow leafed through Time while awaiting the verdict in his trial at Newport, Rhode Island. And in Poland, delegates at a Solidarity meeting used the pages of Time to keep abreast of what the rest of the world was thinking. But it was not always like this. Time's basic change from a rewrite operation to a major news service came during World War II. Dozens of correspondents and photographers covered every phase of the war, and the magazine was on its way toward becoming one of the world's prime sources of information. And as one of Time's editors noted when the atomic bomb ended that war, man's progress is often wombed in war's destruction. All too often, that is indeed the case. The World War II advances in rocketry made by the Germans led almost directly to the development of the rocket that carried Neil Armstrong to the moon. But before man could rocket through space, he had to learn to fly rickety airplanes through the challenging atmosphere of Earth. These and other attacks by man on his environment have always played a major role in the pages of Time, in the departments we call science and technology. And very few events did more for the cause of science and technology than Charles Augustus Lindbergh's heroic solo flight across the Atlantic. Time's report was a classic example of Time style.
The Atlantic, in its immense indifference, was not aware that man-made cables on its slimy bottom contained news, that the silent heavens above pulsed with news that would set thousands of printing presses in motion, news that would make sirens scream in every U.S. city, news that would cause housewives to run out into backyards and shout to their children, "Lindbergh is in Paris."
Of course, if progress had its ups, it also had its downs. And one of the most dramatic setbacks came in the 1937 arrival in America of the German passenger-carrying dirigible, the Hindenburg. And once again, the report was Time style at its best.